So welcome everybody to the NISAC conference speaker session on ag and climate goals. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Allison Chatrchyan. She is the Senior Research Associate at the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences Department at Cornell University. And Allison, I'm gonna let you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much. I mentioned to one of the organizers today that I came to Cornell 10 years ago. Before that, I was in Dutchess County, New York, and part of my work there for many years was supporting the Dutchess County EMC and CAC. So I love all the work that you're doing. It's so important. So today I want to just give you a brief snapshot of the newly being released soon climate impacts assessment for New York State and the agriculture chapter. And so I'll go through that quickly and I can stay for a little bit if you have any questions. Okay, so I want to say to those on the call to please not share the contents of this presentation because it hasn't been published yet. So I'm pulling from a final draft version of the chapter. So if you follow climate change work in New York, you know that in 2011, New York State released the Climate report, and the link is right there if you're interested. I still use that document all the time in my work. And what we were tasked to do is to update the findings of how climate change is impacting the agriculture sector in New York State. That chapter was led by David Wolf, and he's going to be a speaker here today as well. So we were supposed to use a rigorous methodology similar to those used by the IPCC. We were asked to identify key findings for farmers, stakeholders, policymakers on how agriculture is being affected. And then really slightly different, we were tasked with identifying adaptation strategies for each sector. We also looked at underserved farmers, climate equity, and climate justice. And so this is myself and Deborah Aller from Cornell University were the co-chairs here. These were the folks involved. And then David Kay is on this session as a speaker today, and he was on our advisory committee along with all these amazing folks. So we had a lot of great expertise. So this was a really thorough effort. Our chapter right now might be narrowing down through editing, but it's at 100 pages. We had 500 references, 6 case studies. This was something new that we did this time around. So it's outlined here. You can see the focus is on identifying these key climate hazards and then looking at observed and projected impacts and adaptations by sector, including field crops, perennial fruit crops, vegetables, dairy, agroforestry, and maple and aquaculture. And then we were tasked with looking at cross commodity impacts and then kind of broader considerations. So just to give you a sense, this data comes from the introductory chapter for the whole assessment, and it shows climate change is definitely happening in New York. Since 1901, average temps in the state have increased by almost 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and temperatures since 2000 have been higher than any period that's been recorded, similar to the trends we see globally. Projections for the future, average temperatures are projected to increase in all regions of the state throughout the 21st century. And this depends on human action, really. So it could be between 5 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by 2080s. So let me keep going. The changes for precipitation, historical observations, we've seen increased precipitation in the state from 1901 to 2022. The fastest increases occurred since the early 1980s. It's also varied widely by year. Projections for the future, we're going to see an increase in precipitation by about 6 to 17%. And this is in stark contrast to other areas of the country where we're going to see much less precipitation. So keep that in mind. So we looked at key impacts and adaptation strategies by sector. And this just gives you one of the sectors, because we know that the impacts vary by the region of New York State and also by the sector. So climate change impacts are very specific, and the strategies that farmers have to take really depend on how their farm is being impacted, their specific geography, and also what they're growing or producing. For dairy, livestock, and livestock products, we see the key impacts are heat stress, drought, pests, including invertebrates, weeds, and plant diseases, extreme precipitation and flooding, and then animal diseases and parasites. And what we did for each one of these sectors is identify the key impacts and then the strategies that farmers could take. So just for one example, for heat stress, we're recommending from the literature over the last 10 years, these are the practices that farmers can use, including upgrading or expanding cost-effective ventilation or cooling system, providing more shade and pastures. So that's just that one section. So I want to give you our key findings. And the first key finding is that farmers and other ag stakeholders show high awareness and acknowledgement of climate change impacts to agriculture. Farmers, extension agents, technical service providers are reporting increases in extreme weather events, variability, and uncertainty, which has disrupted common operations. Providing more information on anticipated changes and impacts will help these farmers plan and remain profitable. The second key finding, we tried to, in this key snapshot here, which will be used by policymakers, just talk about the impacts that farmers are experiencing most. And these include extreme precipitation, short-term drought, heat stress, warmer spring temperatures, followed by hard freezes, increased pest pressure, and increased management costs. They also include extreme precipitation, damage to crops, fields, and farm infrastructure, short-term drought, reduces crop yields and causes water shortages, heat stress affects livestock, crops, farmers, and farm workers. Spring freezes cause loss in tree fruit and grapes, and increased weed, disease, and insect pressure causes crop damage. These impacts will become more severe over time. The key finding number 3 talks about what we need farmers to do, and they are already doing some of this. Farmers are implementing and investing in practices that make their farm businesses more resilient. While these adaptations are unlikely to fully alleviate the future impacts of projected, they are key to making the state's farms more resilient. We're trying to recognize here that many of these strategies are beneficial for farms, and farmers are already undertaking them. But when you get a huge event like what happened this summer in Vermont and Eastern New York, some of these impacts are going to be huge, and these adaptations may not fully alleviate the impacts. The fourth finding is that climate is a threat multiplier. We found that farmers are already facing a lot of stress, including tight profit margins and labor shortages, and climate change just compounds these stresses. And the fifth finding is that we are really encouraging New York State and all stakeholders to be actively engaged in helping shape climate and ag policies. Farmers need enhanced technical support, research, funding, and incentives to increase adaptation. And so we also, I want to just point out in one more minute, we conducted and developed 6 case studies, one on dairy farms, large and small, apple farming, grape growing and winemaking, field crops, urban farms, and an indigenous case study. And these are really important to provide context for readers. So you can read this quote here from a small dairy farmer in central New York, that it's hard to invest in the farm when there's so much uncertainty about the prices they're going to get for milk. We also included in this assessment a lot of quotes from farmers to try and really contextualize the impacts and changes. And finally, we focused on communities in risk, climate equity considerations, and economic disparity rates. Many farming communities in New York State face high rural poverty rates. And this just shows you a map that we created of the New York State ag districts overlaid with the new disadvantaged communities map to show you, our readers, where there's some really significant challenges. And so that is a really quick overview. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. And the impacts assessment should be published this fall, and it'll be at this URL there. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. Great foundation for this morning's discussion. Next, I would like to welcome Mark Schrader, the Assistant Director of the Cornell Agriculture Experiment Station. He's going to be talking about some land-based carbon solutions. So take it away, Mark, if you are there.
Mark, I'm not able to share my screen. Can you enable that?
Let's see. Sorry about that.
Sounds like there's a couple folks that might want to mute their microphones too.
Yep.
In the meantime.
Why can't?
I just might want to cut in. Anyone not speaking should have a muted.
Yeah, I was trying to keep on top of that.
Okay.
Okay, you can share now, Mark. Sorry about that.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm Mark Schrader, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Cornell University Agricultural Experiment Station. And I also serve as co-chair of Cornell's Carbon Sinks and Sequestration Working Group. And today I'm pleased to share with you a brief overview of land-based carbon management strategies that Cornell seeks to implement on a portion of the 19,000 acres that we manage. I'm not a soil scientist, nor am I an expert in cropping systems, though I will propose recommendations that overlap with these disciplines. I'm a landscape architect. My research interests fall squarely in design, where I seek to incorporate an idea of multifunctionality and nature-based design into Cornell's farm operations, thus reframing the conventional nationwide model of ag experiment stations to weave carbon management, ecological connectivity, watershed management, and enhanced engagement opportunities into the fabric of working landscapes. As some of you will know firsthand, among the litany of impacts affecting farmers, extreme events are on the rise. And this slide comes directly from the climate report that Allison mentioned just previously. Our managers at Cornell AES are seeing crops being stressed, erosion intensifying, plots are flooding, and paradoxically, our managers are now having to react to both flooding and drought events in the same season. Further, not only is agricultural non-point source pollution the leading source of water quality impacts in the United States, but the industry is responsible for an estimated 10 to 12% of global anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. Collectively, the resulting loss of natural systems and the simplification of the landscape over centuries has severely degraded key ecosystems and jeopardizes the long-term provisioning of necessary ecosystem services to and from agriculture. Given that half the Earth's land area is dedicated to agriculture, managing these landscapes with environmental integrity holds extraordinary potential to contribute to impactful solutions to an arguably existential crisis. Cornell's Carbon Sinks and Sequestration Working Group is comprised of roughly 40 engaged faculty and university leaders charged to identify, evaluate, and advance a suite of carbon sequestration and carbon sinks approaches, investments, and projects. It's these strategies that I will review with you this morning. Though not designed exclusively for ag operations, each has the potential to touch down on our farms. And for this presentation, I've categorized the recommended practices into 4 categories, comprising a toolbox of sorts. Process-wise, our working group is in the thick of it right now, moving into a stage that seeks to understand where each practice can effectively touch down. In essence, geolocating each one of them and then quantifying it in both in terms of area and impact. So what I'll share is not meant to be a compendium on the subject matter or to provide a prescriptive step-by-step directions on how to implement each recommendation. Again, I'm not a content expert, but rather my goal is to share a very brief summary of each of the practices that our group has determined important and impactful enough to commit effort and resources to operationalize. Trees, of course, offer immense functionality and have the ability to sequester significant amounts of carbon. First and foremost, we intend to safeguard our forested resources and estimate presently that they already sequester roughly 30,000 metric tons of CO2 annually. One of our subgroups has determined that if dense stands are carefully thinned, the overall health of the forest improves, thus providing a boost to the forest's ability to sequester more carbon, 28% or more, in fact. Integrating livestock with trees, known as silvopasture, the resulting coexistence is achieved by either adding trees to pasture land or thinning existing forested land. Another, alley cropping. Alley cropping, you can think of alley cropping as a system of hedgerows that flank singular fields or alleyways of crops. Of course, this requires relinquishing a portion of production land to trees, so land managers will need to weigh this against its carbon benefit and other co-benefits. As a landscape architect, I find this strategy interesting because there are innumerable species combinations that can be designed to fit your own unique circumstance. Trees can be chosen for their ability to sequester carbon or provide a farmer with a side hustle for specialty crops like cider or chestnuts. Rounding out the tree-based recommendations is afforestation. And here we divide this practice by zones. The upland zone and the riparian zone, that is the transitional area between where land meets streams or rivers. And again, here, the trees are the agents of change. And besides their carbon value, the co-benefits they offer can greatly improve habitat and connectivity, water quality, downstream flooding, and can also provide a secondary revenue stream. And siting is important. And at Cornell, we're looking to incorporate afforestation on underutilized lands that will not result in leakage. Also weighed into our equation are co-benefits like terrestrial connectivity, ecological sensitivity, and nutrient transport mitigation. Here in this slide, in addition to the bucolic rural barn you can see, there's a marginally productive land that's poorly drained at the field. It's a poorly drained field and also at the sensitive headwaters of Cascadilla Creek, thus reimagined as productive forest land. Of course, planting at this scale takes financial commitment and patience, while planting costs estimate upwards of $5,000 per acre and double or triple that amount for appropriate fencing to deal with deer pressure. But wait several decades and you can see that the sequestration benefit is indeed significant. We have 3 recommended systems-based strategies. Management-intensive grazing suggests a model where animals are moved between zones, allowing other zones to rest and recover. Cover cropping creates an agro-ecosystem that can slow erosion, improve soil health, and enhance water availability, and help control weeds, pests, and diseases. Lastly, conservation tillage is a management approach that aims to minimize the frequency or intensity of tillage operations that can result in a decrease of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, less reliance on farm machinery and equipment, and an overall reduction in fuel and labor costs. Nitrogen and methane are common in agriculture and more potent greenhouse gases than CO2. According to the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, methane is 25 times more potent than CO2, while nitrogen is upwards of 300 times more potent than CO2. Combined, they account for roughly 75% of agricultural emissions. So managing these gases, even in small amounts, is very important. Nitrogen management is nothing new. At Cornell and industry-wide, it's already being managed. So the commitment to this practice is to increase the precision of that management, a commitment that includes time, effort, and improved data management. In addition to carbon management benefits, application of rock dust and biochar can promote soil health and result in greater crop production, especially when used in combination, though I'll add that both of these recommendations are still being actively researched. The final recommendations I'll share are turf-based practices. At Cornell, these practices have resulted in an average of 46 metric tons of CO2 sequestered annually over the last decade. Mainly, this has taken place on campus. However, we seek to expand the adoption of these practices more widely into the rural landscape, which includes our ag operations. At Cornell AES specifically, we do a great deal of mowing, and we use a wide array of equipment. So I'm pretty confident that we can make strides towards adopting several of these recommendations, some perhaps easier than others. In conclusion, I've shared several strategies that Cornell University is looking to advance at scale. My hope is that you will be able to use these ideas to create your own toolbox of practices for lands that you may steward. Many thanks for your time and best wishes.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. Our next presenter is Jenna Durario. She is a payment for ecosystem services educator with the Tompkins County Cornell Cooperative Extension, and she's going to be talking a little bit about that pilot payment for ecosystem services program that is just starting up, I guess. Jenna, are you there? Take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Cool. I'll just share my screen. All right. Can you all see my slides okay?
Looks good.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the pilot program that we were working on here in Tompkins County, as well as first, provide a general overview on payment for ecosystem services programs, and generally, define what they are and how they've been functioning in other areas. So before we get into paying for ecosystem services, I just wanted to do a quick overview on defining what they are. So ecosystem services are any positive benefits that ecosystems provide to humans, and they're generally categorized into 4 different types. One being provisioning services, which is the provision of food, fuel, or fiber. 2 being regulating services such as climate, water, and disease regulation, pollination. As I'll get into later, payment for ecosystem service programs generally focus on this category of ecosystem service. And the 3rd category being cultural services, things like educational, aesthetic, and cultural heritage values that are derived from nature, as well as recreation and tourism benefits. And lastly, but probably most importantly, we have supporting services, which are things like soil formation and nutrient cycling, which are really fundamental to our existence as humans and the natural world's existence as well. And today I'll be focusing more on payment for ecosystem service programs in an agricultural context. And as Allison and Mark alluded to, I think really well, the economic challenges and financial trade-offs that farmers face. In our current economy, farmers are paid for provisioning services like food and fiber. However, in order to provide other ecosystem services, they often need to make tough financial decisions in order to stay in business. And payment for ecosystem service programs are a mechanism that are used to ensure that farms can provide these ecosystem services while staying economically viable and continuing to provide food for the community. And this diagram here illustrates the main types of payment for ecosystem service programs and approaches that have been implemented globally. I'm just going to refer to them as PES programs going forward, since repeating payment for ecosystem service programs over and over can sound like a lot. So as I mentioned, I'll be talking about PES programs in the context of agriculture, but I also want to acknowledge that there are forestry focused programs out there, specifically carbon markets focused on carbon sequestration in forests on private lands. And broadly defined payment for ecosystem service programs can incentivize and reward land managers for the ecosystem services that they are providing the broader community through their land management. So things like increased flood and drought resiliency, improved soil health and biodiversity, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, or reduced erosion and water pollution. And while the programs vary differently in how they're actually implemented on the ground, two components that you see across the board are that they are voluntary and they are financially compensating land managers in some way for the ecosystem services that they are providing. And we've historically seen that these programs have been more pay for practice focused, where land managers are paid to implement specific practices on their land. However, we see that these programs are now moving towards a more pay for performance approach, where land managers would be paid for quantifiable ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestered in soil or trees, and improvements in water quality and water infiltration. And you can see here I have nutrient reduction programs listed under types of PES programs. So two examples of those types of programs are, one, the state of Vermont has a pay for phosphorus program where they are paying for reductions in phosphorus runoff off of farm fields. There's also a pilot run through the American Farmland Trust that is working in the Upper Scioto River watershed that's also looking at nutrient runoff. And you can see here, I know there's a lot of talk around private carbon markets. There are several out there available for agricultural producers to access, and they're mostly focused on carbon sequestration in soils and promoting no-till and cover crop practices. And while we see that there are a lot of programs out there, we've seen that farmers in the Finger Lakes region are often excluded from existing PES programs, either due to geographic restrictions from the programs or the fact that most programs focus on late adopters rather than early adopters of regenerative practices or systems. So farms who have already implemented these systems are not able to join these types of programs. And we've also seen that there's potential programmatic and verification costs associated with some of the programs, in particular carbon markets, that inherently exclude smaller farms from accessing because it isn't a financially viable solution for them. And so here, just an illustration, I think really shows well the urban-rural relationship in the watershed context of having a PES program where downstream users are compensating upstream ecosystem service providers for the ecosystem services that they're providing. And so before jumping into the overview of the pilot that we're working on, I did just want to note that across New York State, there are two plans that have recommendations pertaining to PES, one being the New York State Climate Action Council's final scoping plan, and number two being the Tompkins County Food Systems Plan. The final scoping plan explicitly calls for a PES pilot program to be established in New York State as one of its recommendations. I won't read all of this, but I'm sure maybe you all will see the slides after this. And then number two, the Tompkins County Food Systems Plan recommends promoting farmer participation in PES programs. So here in Tompkins County, the Finger Lakes Work Team, which is a community advisory group, has been meeting since 2020, and we were able to secure funding for a pilot program in 2021. So we actually started our pilot in March 2022, and it will run to the end of this year. And we've been working with 6 farms in Tompkins County to test and develop methods to quantify on-farm ecosystem service benefits, such as increased water holding capacity, carbon sequestered in trees that are integrated into agricultural systems, as well as improving water quality. And we're specifically working with farmers of color and beginning farmers with the intent to co-create both the pilot and long-term program design with them. And the farmers, or the farms that we're working with, are all early adopters of regenerative practices and systems. And this was in direct response to the limited access that we saw was available for early adopters and other existing PES programs. And we've successfully completed field sampling sessions in 2022 and 2023 through the integral help of our dedicated community volunteers. And as I mentioned, the pilot period will be ending in December, and then we'll be moving into the implementation pilot period to trial ecosystem service payments to our farms based on the field sampling results in 2023. And we aim to, in the long term, grow the program to the broader Finger Lakes region. And as you can see from this slide in the top right, we have some volunteers learning how to take soil cores by hand. Those are 30-centimeter soil cores. In the bottom right, volunteers taking diameter measurements of the trees to estimate above ground woody biomass and carbon that has been sequestered in trees that are integrated into these systems. And we have on the left our 2 soil consultants working with a Giddings probe to take 1 meter soil cores to look at carbon across the soil profile. And then, as I mentioned, our work team is a community work team. We're always welcoming new members. If you're interested in joining any of our monthly meetings, we have a funding and policy subcommittee, a methods subcommittee, and then our full work team meetings. I'm also happy to meet one-on-one with anyone who's interested in learning generally more about payment for ecosystem service programs, or specifically about the pilot that we've been working on. And I'd be happy to connect with anyone that's interested in learning more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Right, that brings us to our first Q&A break before we pivot to talking a little bit more about solar for the second part of this first session. I've been monitoring the chat and I don't see any questions there. So I guess at this time, I would ask anybody to raise their hand if they have any questions for any of the first 3 speakers. Then you'll be able to unmute yourself. Hopefully, if I did all that right. So, you know, we've got about 7-8 minutes here. Let's see. If no one has any questions, we can all grab a coffee or something. All right, got Martha Robertson. Go ahead and unmute, Martha.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just for Jenna, what kind of funding are we talking about? If you know, what's the payment, how's it based, and where do the funds come from, especially as you look long term?
That's a great question, Martha. Right now we're working on philanthropic funds, so we have several grants that we have been working with to fund the pilot itself. And acknowledging too, at this point, we're not paying for ecosystem services. We compensate farmers to work with us on the program as a community engagement stipend. Long term, we have been looking at different public and private options that could be possible and starting conversations to see where that funding could be a long-term sustainable source. So that's where looking at the CLCPA's recommendation for the state to have a PES pilot, where we've been engaging in conversations with Climate Action Council members to better understand how we can support that recommendation. We're doing a lot of the on-ground, I would say, research that is needed to look at this long-term, and there are questions that come up about funding as we've been moving forward. So I would not say we have a definitive source at this point, but that is part of the pilot program itself, is identifying that long-term funding. Hope I answered your question.
Yeah, more like how much money per farmer per growing season? What is the range?
I would say for context, in a carbon market, we see prices of $10 to $15 per acre for carbon sequestered in soils, which for a large farm, that could add up to quite a bit of money, but for a smaller farm, that may not be enough to really incentivize them to join that type of program. We've been discussing along the ranges of $3,000 to $5,000 per year per farm, pending soil sampling results and how well the farm is actually providing ecosystem services. And with the carbon payment, we've been looking through the context of the social cost of carbon. New York State has, a range of numbers based on the discount rate, anywhere from 120 to 150 for per ton of carbon sequestered. So we've been actively looking at that as a potential figure in calculating the payment long term.
Thanks very much.
All right, sorry about that. All right, next I see Greg Nelson.
So I may have missed this because everybody was talking fast, but it seems one of the big potential sequestration possibilities is just increasing topsoil carbon content. And I'm wondering what kind of research is being done on that in this area. I mean, I saw silvopasture being mentioned, but that seems to be, to have a much larger potential than above ground carbon.
I can jump on real quick to say that you're right. A large focus of the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment Ag chapter this round was on soil health as a strategy to sequester carbon, as well as prevent runoff and erosion. And so it really has co-benefits for adaptation and mitigation. And so there's an entire section of the chapter that's coming out this fall on soil health. There's also a tremendous amount of research at Cornell. You can look on the internet for the Cornell Soil Health Program or Soil Health Initiative. There's a soil health lab. There's a lot of resources to help farmers do soil health assessments on their farms. I need to jump off, Mark, but anyone can email me if they have further questions. Thank you all.
Thanks, Allison.
That's great.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Ann Clark.
Yeah, real quick, I was just curious because the comment had been made that some of the carbon sequestration working group had, they're really focusing on larger farms or larger initiatives, and I wondered how big the farms were that Jenna's working with, or are there focus farms, and also the degree to which the Schrader's group has interactions with Jenna's described initiative about planning farms, giving those farms a plan, if you will.
So the farms we're working with are very small. The mean size is 35 acres and the largest is 100 acres. And we're specifically decided to work with smaller farmers and just working with farmers of color and beginning farmers. They generally have smaller farms, we found in this county. So both wanting to focus on smaller farms and that demographic led to very small farm sizes. And in terms of working with Mark's group, I have not personally, but I believe Graham Savio, who is part of our work team, has either been in conversation with Mark or with the work team. But Mark, if you want to jump in on that, feel free as well.
You bet, Jenna. So yeah, we haven't worked with Jenna's team, and that's by design. Really, our focus is specifically and solely lands managed by Cornell University, and that that goes from small acreage parcels all the way up to farm operations that are several hundred acres in scale. But again, it's focused solely on not necessarily transferring those findings and that knowledge to the outside world yet. I think that's, you know, in a subsequent phase. But right now, again, we're focusing only on lands managed by Cornell University.
Great, thank you.
All right. I think we're still staying in this session for two more speakers. I'm getting a little bit of a conflicting message that I'm supposed to be ending this meeting now, but I don't think that's correct because I think we still have two more speakers in this room.
Mark, you're correct. That was my mistake. Yeah.
No worries. Okay, just making sure. So I think we are good to move on to our fourth speaker. Now we're kind of shifting over to talking about solar energy. And so our next presenter is David Kay, Senior Extension Associate with the Department of Global Development at Cornell. And he's going to be talking sort of an overview of large-scale solar development in New York State.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen, Mark?
We can
All
see
right.
it.
Thank you.
right,
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So just to note that there's a lot of work going on with a lot of different people at Cornell about various aspects of solar, and my colleague Max Zhang will be presenting next on some other aspects of that work. So probably most people know about the series of legislation that was passed, essentially decarbonize, goals for decarbonizing the state. Maybe slightly fewer would know about this ancillary legislation called the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which is really helping to implement that larger policy. It does what it says. Its primary goal is to accelerate the siting and coming online of renewable energy, particularly electricity generating projects, and it's a modification of legislation that had existed previously. It really essentially sets deadlines for the state to make decisions about large facilities, as you can see here. Or as was an office that was created, the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. I'm not really focused on this today, but it does, there's a lot of controversy about who gets to have influence and exactly how under this legislation. So this is just some of the language there about there is room for local input. And the state is required to consider local laws, but it does have the authority to override under certain conditions. What I'm going to kind of focus on again is large scale facilities, which is what I've just been talking about, which means essentially 20 to 25 megawatt facilities or larger. And one of the key factors, sort of from a statewide perspective that I think is really important to focus on is how much is needed, how much solar are we going to have in New York State? And nobody knows the answer to that, but we have some estimates of how much is needed. And one of them is sort of base case scenario that we might need approximately 20 gigawatts by 2050. So that's kind of, if things go on the trajectory that they had been on. Here's the estimate of a more aggressive plan forward. We might need as much as, in this case, estimate of 65 gigawatts. So you can see there's a pretty large increase being expected under some scenarios. And these are, of course, if we're trying to meet our carbon decarbonization goals. So what does that translate into in terms of land use and agriculture? There's a recent estimate that we used to say 5 to 10 acres of land per megawatt needed. That's been coming down because of increased efficiencies. So we're now talking more like 3 to 7 acres per megawatt. So what does that translate into to meet the state's goals? There's a bunch of different ranges, but let's say we need 50 gigawatts. That would be 250,000 acres. Is that a lot or a little? Depends on what you think about 250,000 acres. So here's some possible benchmarks. There are many other ones you could look at. We have 30 million acres of land in New York State, approximately. Of that, about 7 million is farmland. So if we were to develop only on farmland for solar, we would use about 1 to 4% of New York State farmland, depending again on exactly how many acres you think will go into solar. However, that won't be evenly distributed, almost certainly. So some counties would have much more, some towns and communities would have a much higher proportion of land conversion to solar than others. So here's another benchmark that may or may not be useful for some of you to look at. American Farmland Trust analysis of farmland conversion over 15 years. And of course, that's permanent conversion. Roughly the same amount over 15 years converted out of farmland to housing as the 50 gigawatts needed.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay, so just a few more slides here. Here's just a sense of where large facilities have been proposed and approved already. Historically, there's about 4.6 gigawatts as of 2022 that were in here. I'll note that a lot of these facilities they get proposed and they do not make it into the real world. They get canceled for various reasons. So that's something to remember in what I'm going to be showing you next. And these different colors are basically different types and scales of projects that are being proposed, which I'll talk about in a second. It's probably important to know that for large facilities, we do have a lot of rooftop and community scale already in New York, which I'm not talking about in terms of large facilities at the scale I'm talking about. There aren't very many that have already been built. There's one 32 megawatt facility that's been around for quite a while. The other 9 are all what I would call on the small end of large. Then they've all gone through local, not almost all of them have gone through local review rather than state review because they're small enough to do that. So here's the largest one that's been around since 2011 at 32 megawatts on Long Island. If you take a look at this chart, what you're going to see is there are a lot of projects that have been proposed. Most of them are 20 megawatt facilities or smaller. Just as a reminder, that's, let's say, 100 acres or smaller, which is large in some ways. But if you look at the megawatts that have been proposed to help us decarbonize, most of those facilities are in the large, most of the megawatts are in the large facility range of 151 to 500 megawatts. That was a few years ago. As a reminder, if it's 20 to 25 megawatts or less, it goes through local permit review. The larger ones go through state permit review. And I updated those figures just a month or so ago. We have about 20 gigawatts currently being proposed. Again, many of those will not actually happen. So 92% of those are in the 25 megawatt or above range. So we're on a trajectory for a smaller number of large facilities primarily that will go through state review. A lot of this is based on, it's out of date by a year or two, but in large facilities that were proposed at that time, we kind of looked at the land use that was being proposed to be impacted. Again, these have not actually been built. But I think it's fair to say that a lot of the agricultural land is very attractive for these facilities, and that will continue to be the case unless policy changes dramatically. Probably many of you have heard of the term agrivoltaics. There is a lot of interest in that at scale. There's a lot of research. We're in research phases. We're not actually at stages of implementation of large-scale agrivoltaics. This is just a sign of some of the, this is a slide showing some of the different kinds of designs and crops that are being experimented with, essentially. The thing that is kind of already a reality is solar grazing. People around here actually got the American Solar Grazing Association started, so this is pretty well established, especially at community scale. There's some questions left about how scalable this is in New York State. But it's successful. I'm concluding here. I'm just mentioning that I am a member of New York State's Agricultural Technical Working Group, which is a NYSERDA advisory body. We're there to advise the state on the potential interactions between renewable energy development and farming and ag lands. And essentially what we're trying to do is help NYSERDA prioritize what kinds of solar projects they are willing to incentivize through something called the Smart Solar Siting Scorecard, which is in place already but evolving. And it essentially incentivizes developers to propose projects that avoid farmland, to some extent other sensitive kinds of lands, and if it does impact those kinds of lands, to put in place various kinds of mitigations such as agrivoltaics and other things for communities. And anybody who's interested, I could provide a lot more detail, but we don't have time to go in on it. And that is my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. All right, our last speaker of the morning is going to pick right up, talking about what David mentioned there at the end, the subject of agrivoltaics. So we have Max Zhang, who is a professor of engineering at the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Cornell. He's going to be talking about some of the latest research coming out of that new and interesting topic of agrivoltaics. Take it away, Max.
Hey, thank you. So David is on my team, on my DOE project team. So apparently, but we haven't coordinated our presentation very well, right? So there can be some overlap. So I think David already mentioned, right? So in the CLCPA goal, we are looking at somewhere between 60 to 65 gigawatts of solar by 2050. Right? Also, I want to mention here is this is not just New York things, right? So this is the DOE Energy Information Administration. Their projection, of course, they basically project how much solar are going to install at the beginning of the year, right? So this is actually a very stunning number, right? So the half of the new generation electric generation generating capacity will be solar, right? So and then we are talking about this year likely 29 gigawatt nationwide, right? And this actually the first time is in target with DOE, the very ambitious goal in their solar future studies. They call for 30 gigawatt per year in the first 5 years, and then 60 kilowatt per year in the next 5 years, right? So this is actually the first time actually meet very close to the target. I think David also mentioned that. So currently we do, this is a paper from my group as well. We are looking at not just current land use for solar, but also future, right? I think we are looking at suitable land in New York State for solar development, and we found more than 80% of the land suitable for solar going to be agriculture. So I think the big context here is that the conventional design, this is what I call the conventional design. Conventional design is essentially is a mono use design. You design for one purpose, to generate electricity, and you basically want to have the panel space as close as they can, right, without shading each other. but to increase the density of the panel, right? So this, as we can imagine, right? So building 60 gigawatt solar in your state with design like this will cause likely, right? So will lead to a number of consequences on the ecological system, on the farmland. Also, we see community have opinions on those so-called industrial solar development, right? So we're hoping, I think we see the industry, the solar development is a transitional mode, right? From a conventional design, a mono-use design to a multi-use design, right? But of course, we don't know what's the best multi-use design will be like yet, right? Likely will depend on the locations. But I think both the industry and regulators agree we're not going to build conventional solar farm 10 years from now, right? So then in some way that's the context for my research. I think David mentioned the solar grazing. I think I want to say here is there's a lot of research interest toward grazing beyond sheep, right? Right now I think sheep grazing has become very successful in the way, and I was told that in the state we just don't have enough sheep, right, to support solar. But also cattle grazing or having other animals, right, pigs, take advantage of the space at the solar farm. I think that's one of the richer directions several institutions are looking at. Pollinator habitat, I don't remember David mentioned that, but that's also more like a low-hanging fruit that you don't need you can plant those wildflowers at conventional solar sites, provide pollinator habitats. But the caveat here is it only become beneficial that you have crops around it, right, can benefit from pollinators. And so I would say the largest potential, or also the larger challenge, is in the crop production, right? So in the compared to say the hotter, dry states like Arizona or California, Northeast here we have an inherent challenge, right? Where the crop growth and the solar and electric generation are competing for the same thing. They're competing for solar radiation, right? So that's why it's much a challenging problem how to come up with a good design, not only in terms of the planting, but also in terms of harvesting, right? So I think that's the big challenge. Also, I think another, I would like to challenge the solar industry to think about is how to make solar farms more like a part of the community rather than a segregated fence line properties, right? So there are ideas being pursued, right? So my bar is, if you start seeing people having wedding ceremony at the solar farm, and you probably made it, right? So I talk to many people from industry, from communities, members from farmers, right? So those are like 4 types of opinions I have collected. So I'm not going to read it, one by one, but sort of you'll see that people have different opinion on whether the studios or agritech is really the solution, right, to have more sustainable solar farms being built here. Of course, my opinion is toward D here, right? So I think it's definitely challenging, right? But also we see opportunities So we had to find a way having solar company and farmer work together, right? And how to design solar farm. That's actually works. So quickly about the research in my group here. So we focus on the microclimate, microclimate in terms of, temperature, ground level, radiation, soil moisture, and, vegetation, how research those aspects and to support agrivoltaic designs. So we're doing modeling, this type, different type of modeling, also monitoring at current operating solar farm to gather data to support the development of design tools for this, once again, this multi-use solar farm design. Just some ideas, right? I think the key here is that we had to try to find a synergy between renewable generation and agriculture, right? So if we frame at a zero-sum game, right, that's a losing argument of, right at the gate, right? So we had to find a synergy. So one synergy, for example, we found that if you have a crops grow under a panel, basic idea here is that you can have this passive cooling potential, basically to cool the panel, right? So because evaporation, the transpiration process from the vegetation beneath. So cooler panel means higher efficiency, even though it's not very significant, but because solar farm pretty large, right? A little bit gain, conversion efficiency, you typically much better off. And another idea here is that we can, tracking systems are very popular, right? It's a mainstream. We can control the tracking to support the crops, right? Rather, once again, to find the synergy between those. I think I'll end with this, right? So we're hoping this is the vision. We are hoping the future solar farm will be like, I'm probably running out of time here. Firstly, right now we are at the decide, announce, defend phase in terms of development, right? We're hoping to build a model for a engage, deliberate, and decide model. Right now we are from single land use to multi-use, right? Right now, solar farm being perceived by community as industrial facility, and how we can create all different opportunities to turn into our community assets. I think that's the end of my talk. Right, thank you.
Thanks very much, Max, and thanks to all of our speakers. We now have another 10-ish minutes for Q&A, so you should be able to unmute and start video if you want to. Please raise your hand if you have any questions for either of these last two presenters. Looks like Martha Robertson's going to kick us off again with the Q&A.
Yeah, I've talked about this with David Kay in the past. What about the issue of access to the grid influencing placement, the siting of solar facilities, and if the cost to actually hook up to the grid were amortized over a broader base, let's say over, and not just project based. Right now, every project has to absorb the cost of integrating with the grid, and that incentivizes, putting, that really drives the placement decisions. What if the costs were amortized over a broader base? Let's say developers paid a fee per megawatt into a fund, and then you might be able to see more marginal land that might be farther from the grid would be economically viable for more projects, and then therefore less disruptive, less controversial in communities.
Yeah, I would, I don't know about the specific mechanisms. In theory, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, because right now it'd be very quickly, as you're implying, it very quickly becomes economic for a developer to develop land if it's far from either a substation or a transmission line. So yes, it's a very useful theoretical idea. There's no mechanism in place really right now that I know of that enables that to happen. I would also just point out that depending on who you talk to, defining marginal lands can get tricky in the sense that, you know, we're talking about ecosystem services previously. Some quote unquote marginal lands from an agricultural perspective, for example, are valuable lands from an ecosystem service perspective in terms of habitat or something like that. So I think to move in this direction, there it would be very useful to have a better analysis than has been done so far of how far away from utility lines, how much sort of quote unquote ideal land is available within, you know, instead of 1 to 3 miles, maybe 5 to 10 miles of utility lines. But it's a very interesting idea.
So if I add a little bit to what David said, I think, Martha, I think your point could be very useful in terms of rebalancing the scale of the development, right? So my understanding is that for the community solar, you know, 5 megawatt-ish solar or below, they're citing almost dominantly by you know, driven by interconnection, right? So, and for large scale solar, you know, 20 megawatt or 25 megawatt out, or actually more like we're talking about hundreds of megawatts, they are less sensitive to the internet because they can just build you know, infrastructure, right? Because the size of the program. You know, I think also typically we see the community opinion more favorable to smaller development. Right? Once you have a larger, bigger development, they have to, you know, community tend to have issues, right? So I think that's, you know, the idea you propose could be, you know, right now we see, especially with the current economic situations here, if the, you know, basically there could be incentivize more smaller development, you know, large number of smaller development rather than fewer really big.
And I might just, since I don't see any other hands, I'll just add to that. Right now, you know, economies of scale, for those of you who know that, the larger the project, the cheaper per unit of electrical output. Right now, the economies of scale favor large developments quite significantly. That's not likely to change unless there's some very significant policy intervention. So what the point I'm trying to make is that's the reason, if you looked at my slides, you're seeing a large number of or a large percentage of the plan of the private sector interacting with public sector decisions being made are saying, hey, if we're going to decarbonize, we're going to do it with a relatively small number of very large facilities.
One other hand raised. Oh. Sorry.
And Clark, yes.
I just raised, yeah, Ann Clark, one more hand raised from
Hey,
Ann.
real quick then, I was just curious, given the rather large amount of land is obviously estimated to go into increased housing, to what degree creative roofing solutions, roofing solar, window pane solar, which I've seen in New Zealand, can actually offset some of our estimates of how much land actually has to go to intensive solar farms.
You want to handle that from a technical perspective, Max?
I think just if you know, we're talking about very ambitious goal, right? So we're talking about, in the States, we're talking about more than 60 gigawatt of solar. We just don't have enough rooftop space to meet the goal, right? So, if I don't have number with me, but order of magnitude, if you basically have a solar panel on all the roofs, suitable, right? Not all roofs are able to do that. I think we probably got a gigawatt, single number gigawatt level, right? But we're talking about 60 gigawatt, 60, right? So I don't think, of course, that's always good, right? Always good to have more rooftop. But I think, it technically is feasible to achieve our 60 gigawatt goal by just relying on rooftop.
Yeah, and I would agree with Max, basically, in both things that I think you just emphasized. One is that, yes, we need as much as is feasible of that type of development that you were just mentioning, but it will make a difference. And we already have about 4 gigawatts under the New York Sun program, a little more than 4 gigawatts over the past 20 years of solar that have come in mostly very small scale. So that's not insignificant, and it's going to increase, but we're not going to get to 60 gigawatts that way. And then the last thing I'll say, there is aside from just rooftop, there is a program that I hope accelerates. Right now, it's very small scale and slow moving. Trying to look at essentially what some people call least impact sites, and really trying to essentially help get the sites that are most suited to solar development ready for development. But so far it hasn't affected very much acreage. So, because there are a lot of other places that people think about that would seem very suitable for solar, aside from just rooftop, former industrial sites, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a push in that direction. It should be pushed to the maximum, but it won't get us where we need to go.
Thank you. And I didn't mean that it was going to completely substitute. I was just curious as to the degree to which it would contribute.
No, it's important, definitely.
But also the rooftop does have some justice concern, complication, right? So because I would say probably half of the population in the state does not have, do not have rooftop to benefit from those programs, right? So that's
right.
not the reason why the ground-based, community-based, community solar can help address this justice issue, right?
I'll also mention that rooftop solar per kilowatt or per megawatt is generally significantly more expensive than utility scale solar. So.
All right, if there are no more questions, I think there's about 7 minutes before the next session starts. At this time, I'm going to remake Simon the host of this meeting. And I think my portion as moderator is finished. Thanks everybody for a stimulating discussion this morning. Simon, if you're there, I don't know if you have any words to say to this group in advance of what's next. It's quite possible Simon is doing something else. All right, I'm gonna leave this running because Simon asked me to make him host, and I'm not sure if I should end the Zoom meeting, but I don't think anybody else needs to stay. I think this will be the same length for the session starting at 10:30. So I'm just gonna kind of hang out till I hear otherwise, but thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate you.